President Trump talks about the need to bring peace, whether it's in Russia and Ukraine, whether it's in the Middle East. We, of course, have to recognize that as a policy oriented towards saving lives and carrying out one of Christ's most important commandments, but I think we must also recognize it as an effort to protect the religious liberty of Christians, because over the past 40 years, it has often been historical Christian communities who bear the brunt of failed American foreign policy. And that is, in my view, perhaps the most important way in which Donald Trump has been a defender of Christian rights all over the world. He has a foreign policy that is oriented towards peace. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Nicholson. I am the editor-at-large of Providence Magazine, joined here by my Providence colleagues, and in a moment with a special guest. I'm quoting to you from a speech that Vice President J.D. Vance gave at the 2025 National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. Vice President Vance is known for his personal concern for Christians of the Middle East, some of which is related to his own experience as a Marine in Iraq, and later as a Catholic convert, in realizing that accidentally the United States, in its pursuit of regime change in Iraq, harmed the Christians who lived in that country. This is an issue that I've worked on quite a bit, something that the Institute on Religion and Democracy and Providence Magazine in particular has been involved with for some time. This is an issue that matters to us. We think it's an issue that matters to the world, and it seems to matter to the Trump administration. The question is, are we, the United States, doing enough? I'm joined today by editor of Providence Magazine, president of IRD, Mark Tooley, McDonald Scholar of Ethics, War, and Public Life, Mark Levesque, and Providence managing editor James Diddams. Gentlemen, how are you today?
Doing great, Robert. Thanks for doing this again.
The task of helping Christians of the Middle East, and I would add to that Christians in Africa or other places where Christians are facing oppression, persecution, is easier said than done as a matter of policy. We care about them, we Christians, and I would add to that, anyone who cares about religious freedom. But the question of how to actually help them and to what extent helping them should be a part of U.S. foreign policy has always been a really tricky question. Before we get into this conversation, I want to lay out some of the elements of that trickiness. Part of the problem, of course, let's just zoom back into the Middle East, is that in this part of the world, Christians are a very small part of the population. Of course, if we go back long enough, Christians were in fact the vast majority of this region. It's hard to even imagine a Christian Middle East, but it was that, certainly, and even for several centuries after the Islamic conquests. But right now, as things stand today, the Christian community is small. They're very much outnumbered. Muslims are of course, the vast majority of the population in the region. Other non-Muslim communities, including the Jews of Israel, are smaller but still larger than the Christian communities by and large. The Christians are historically pretty weak. They don't have much power. I'm talking now about raw physical power inside the countries where they live. They are not known, with a few exceptions, for creating militias, amassing arms, right, waging insurgencies against standing governments. They don't have, for the most part, certainly today, much in the way of outside backers, in the way, say, Hezbollah in Lebanon has in Iran, or the Sunnis of Syria now have in, say, Saudi Arabia or some of the countries of the Gulf. Christians are also pretty reluctant to make noise, right? Being small, being weak, it's not really a good idea to raise one's head and rock the boat too much, right? There's just very little to gain and far too much to lose. I don't think it helps that Christianity as a religion has within it the raw materials for quietism, right? There's a very strong case to be made, and which has been made, and particularly by Christians of the Middle East, that look, the real mission of Christians is to pursue the kingdom of God. We respect government. We are not interested in trying to change it, replace it. We are perfectly happy if this or that government comes to be, so long as we're allowed to be kind of unmolested and to pursue our faith. Weirdly, from our perspective as Americans, that position sometimes in certain countries has ended up putting them on the opposite side of U.S. interests, right? Putting them on the side of Iran or some other kind of, Muslim majority power that we don't like. But there's a reason behind that. Of course, on the American side, there's a real question, and this is getting sort of to questions of church and state. To what extent is protection of Christians in an ideal world part of foreign policy, right? And speaking as a Christian, as an American, from almost any perspective, the idea that that would be a pillar or even an important element of U.S. foreign policy has given many people, and even many Christians, pause. Is that really something that the U.S. government should do? And by the way, the more you speak to Middle East Christians, the more one comes to also believe that maybe putting this as a major part of U.S. foreign policy is actually more likely to do them harm than to do nothing. All of these things are swirling around the question of helping Middle East Christians. And it does come down to that question, right? What should we do, and are we doing enough? And that's a question that was raised in a recent article by a Princeton PhD student named Onsi Kamal in an essay entitled How America Betrayed Middle East Christians. That was an article published in, I believe, late April at Mere Orthodoxy. Very interesting. And the essay, the title of the essay, obviously holds the answer to the question as far as Kamal is concerned. And he says, no, America is not doing enough. And not only is America not doing enough, America has betrayed Middle East Christians, and in some pretty callous and specific ways. Professor, author Randall Fowler, someone who's written for Providence before, wrote a response, also published at Mere Orthodoxy, where he agrees with some of what Kamal says, disagrees with some other elements. And we thought this is precisely the kind of question that we at Providence Magazine should unpack, right? It's relevant for any number of reasons. And to discuss all of that, we have invited the executive director of In Defense of Christians, Rich Ghazal, to tell us what he thinks about this question and respond in some way to the arguments in both of these articles. Rich, it is a pleasure to have you on the ProvCast.
Thanks for having me, Robert, and it's great to be with you all today.
You are, notwithstanding the fact that you were not born in the Middle East, a kind of Middle East Christian and being a member of the Syriac Orthodox Church. I thought before we get into all the big abstract questions of policy, you could maybe tell the audience a bit about the Syriac Orthodox Church, Middle East Christianity in general, and what you do at IDC and why it matters to you personally.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that opportunity up front. Middle East Christianity is it's a 2,000-year-old brand of Christianity. We subscribe to the Nicene Creed, much like most of Western Christian Orthodoxy. What makes us a little different, specifically the Syriac Orthodox Church, is we are non-Chalcedonian, meaning that at the Council of Chalcedon there was some difference on Christology with respect to the natures, two natures versus one nature, and so forth. Without going down a theological rabbit hole, that is the historical context. So the Syriac Orthodox Church finds itself together with the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Coptic, and the Ethiopian churches. Middle Eastern Christianity, as I said, has been around for 2,000 years. Much of Christians in the Middle East, Egypt notwithstanding, belong to the Catholic Church. Also, the Greek Orthodox Church in the form of the Rome Church, which is a Byzantine Rite church. Although Byzantine Rite, they have Catholic as well as Orthodox versions of that Byzantine church. And then, of course, the Copts in Egypt, as I mentioned previously. As you've mentioned, certainly prior to the 20th century, but even going further back, Prior to the 7th century and 8th century and the Islamic conquest, the Middle East was a very different place demographically. Prior to a century ago, about 20% of the Middle East demographics was Christian. Prior to, let's say, the 7th century, well, we don't know the exact numbers, but it was a it was a Christian neighborhood, let's say. Certainly the metropolitan areas, that's not, if not to say the Gulf as well, although there are signs that Christianity was alive and well and prominent in the Gulf. Christianity finds itself in the Middle East in a very different situation today, where numbers, anybody's guess really, but numbers are estimated to be around 1% of the Middle East population are Christian. The former bastions of Christianity, like Syria, like Iraq, and even Turkey, now find themselves down 1% or below, roughly speaking, in those countries. Lebanon is the exception to that. While it's in the Levant, neighbor to Syria, for many reasons, political reasons and otherwise, it still has probably around a 33% Christian population. But even that is threatened for a number of political reasons, which I'm sure we'll talk about today.
Well, I want to say a little bit more about your background. I think it's relevant. You are a Syriac Christian. You're running IDC, but what I think is unique about your perspective, at least kind of in the small universe of organizations and people that work on this issue, is your background as a retired U.S. Air Force intelligence officer and judge advocate. You've served as a legal advisor to the Secretary of the Air Force, special U.S. attorney, federal criminal prosecutor. You worked as an intelligence officer in the Levant on political military issues. You've commanded, 1,000, 1,500 hours of surveillance, reconnaissance operations. You've got multiple degrees. You've quite literally seen this from 30,000 feet, right? This whole issue, and you understand the Middle East Christian issue in the context of the larger question of U.S. policy in the region. And I think that that combination, sort of from the ground level as a Syriac Christian, as well as from the air as a U.S. Air Force officer, I think really broadens this discussion and makes it even more relevant for Providence. So let me tee you up here, just asking you, for those who have not read the two essays I mentioned at the outset, to just kind of quickly summarize what Kamil said, what Fowler said in response, and then we'll get into it. What your response is, what you think these articles get right, what you think wrong, and then we'll kind of have a conversation. Maybe kind of unpack some of the different elements, maybe push back on some of them as well. But before we do all of that, let's have everybody understand what we're talking about. What were these two articles arguing about this so-called betrayal?
Right. Yeah, so Kamil's argument essentially was, I largely agree with it, but before getting into that, let's just summarize it. His argument is that the U.S. Policy community has betrayed Christians of the Middle East for a whole list of reasons. Some I agree with, some I don't agree with, certainly. Some I think are mistargeted, some I believe are stated a little bit extremely. The first one is the consequences of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. The U.S. involvement of the Middle East has been, let's say, it's decades long. It's not just something that started in 9/11, right? It started, as is mentioned in the rebuttal article, in 1958. That's the first involvement where U.S. forces were used in the Middle East. Before that, there was diplomatic involvement, but that was the first one. That was a response to Cold War encroachment into Lebanon. But before that, there wasn't really much going on. The first few involvements in the Middle East were actually positive, and positive for Christians and positive for the region. There was no real blowback that was identifiable at the time. Looking at it decades later, maybe you can identify something. But along the way, things got things went off the rails. It could have been an extreme or emotional response to 9/11, which some of course, U.S. response to 9/11 was warranted, productive, constructive, and we look back, and we could probably still say that about certain things 25 years later. The one that Kamal is referencing specifically is the U.S. invasion of Iraq, of course, where before the 2003 invasion, 1.5 million Christians called Iraq home. Today, it's 10% of that. It's about 150,000, and that's in some cases a high estimate, as some people have reported. Of course, the Syrian civil war, while we didn't have a kinetic role in that war, we certainly supported. We picked a side very early, let's say that. We saw an uprising against President Assad, the former President Assad, and we loved that. And that indeed is a good thing that it occurred. But of course, we responded so quickly, and I would even say emotionally to that, where we threw our lot in with the guys who were picking up arms against him without really fully knowing who these guys are. But they called themselves a Free Syrian Army, and the word "free" was in there, so we were taken by the word "free." And of course, that we look back a number of years later, and we can see how that played out. It played out in a very interesting way now, today in Syria, actually, where the guys that we thought were good, then we thought were bad, and now we think maybe we can kind of give them a chance again. As of right now, no indications to say one way or another, but we're all cautiously optimistic, and U.S. policy is certainly chasing that one right now, and we can talk certainly more about that in a moment. And then, of course, the recent conflicts post October 7th, 2023, where U.S. involvement once again has come under the microscope and has received a lot of criticism from many segments of U.S. society, as well as the political landscape. His other critique that Kamal makes, aside from U.S. intervention over the last 20-some years, is the sort of shifting opinion, within Congress and the political landscape on Christians of the Middle East. He mentioned specifically Vice President Vance. Prior to becoming vice president, he spoke very passionately and committedly on Christians of the Middle East, that something needs to be done, and he certainly meant it. And now, as Kamal argues, he's sort of changed his opinion, and he's throwing himself behind the greater current of U.S. politics and foreign policy, and whatever's expedient is sort of the argument there. And of course, conservative support, Christian conservative support in the United States for Israel, and he's quite critical about that. And he kind of creates this dichotomy between the state of Israel, the existence of the state of Israel, support for the state of Israel on one side, and the interests, protection, preservation of Christians in the Middle East on the other side of that dichotomy, which I think is a pretty bad construction, right? That dichotomy that he creates. He cites a number of incidents where Christian churches and in hospitals and otherwise in Gaza Strip, as well as in Lebanon, were destroyed, and in Christian casualties resulting from Israel's campaign of defense against Hamas, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon. Then he discusses the church response, the American church response, of course, talking about lauding the positive response that he's seen coming from some places, but mostly spending time on talking about the indifference and betrayal, as he calls it, from a large segment of American Christianity. He does mention the Pope and the clarity that the Pope brings to the conversation in his championing for the advocacy and prayer for Christians in the Middle East. And then finally, he closes with you might call it a moral admonishment, where he says, we will be accountable for the decisions we make, the positions we take, and our failure to help those in need and those weaker than we. So that's the long and short of his article. Like I said, I agree with a lot of the points he makes. I think some of them are misguided, maybe mistargeted, but without a doubt, extremely stated. I don't disagree that there was probably call it maybe indifference, maybe complacency, maybe uninformed American population and political leaders. But I don't know that betrayal is warranted, particularly given the demonstrated commitment that American society shows for the needy, the downtrodden, and the persecuted.
Yeah, I want to go a bit deeper into what 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 you just said, what the things you agree with, the things you disagree with, and kind of take us a little bit more into where you think U.S. policy should go. And you alluded to what our policy seems to be right now in Syria, for example, and I want to get into that. But before we do that, I want to ask you about this follow-up piece written by Randall Fowler. What is his response to Camel's argument? Which parts does he see as valid, and which parts does he see as invalid?
Yeah, I liked Fowler's piece. I like Kamal's piece. I agreed with a lot, and I thought some of it may be valid arguments, but maybe speak past the argument that that Kamal was attempting to make. For example, I mean, he opens by agreeing with the bottom line, essentially. Yeah, we're not doing enough. Yeah, what we've done in the past 20 plus years has been disastrous for Christians in the Middle East and many others, in the region at large. But he talks, or he argues for sort of a more nuanced approach, a more historically sensitive approach that takes into account a lot more than just disgruntled displeasure with current policy and how it's played out. So the five key factors that Fowler discusses, number one, is sort of the history of, as he calls, revolutionary ideologies, pro-Russian, pro-Soviet, anti-American tendencies, and political movements that Christians have sort of attached themselves to over the last number of centuries. That is true to some extent, not entirely true, because for every example of a Christian leader or thinker hopping on board with sort of a Soviet or a Marxist, or not even extremely Marxist, but Arab socialist movement, there's another example or two or three for every example of that, of Christians standing in support of the West and standing with the West, and even fighting alongside Israel in some cases. As hard to believe as that may be, Lebanon and civil war may be one example of that. But he does talk about this. But one thing that I would kind of modify a bit on that argument is the fact that if a Christian ever, and they have, stood with pro-social Arabist or Arab socialist movements, or even Russian Soviet movements, it's out of necessity, right? They do this, and they have done this for several years, ever since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Right after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the first thinkers that developed this idea of Arab socialism, secular nationalism, were Christians. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because post-Ottoman Empire, the two options for rule of law or for rule of society were either Islamism, political Islamism, or Arab socialism, secular nationalism. Well, obviously the natural choice for a Christian minority in that area in such a turbulent time of such uncertainty would be secular nationalism, obviously. As the 20th century progressed, that became closer associated with Russia and Russian interests, particularly the rise of the Ba'athist Party and the proxy war that played out in Lebanon and that sort of thing. But let's not forget, we also talked about, and in fact Fowler cites in his article, 1958, where President Camille Chamoun aligned with the United States, in fact brought the United States in, asked President Eisenhower to bring his Marine Corps into Lebanon to fight off the Nasserite socialists, the Arab socialists coming out of Egypt, who swallowed up Syria and wanted to swallow up Lebanon. So that was a very pro-West, pro-American example in history. And I would argue that's a more reflective, accurately reflective example in history, because when the Christians are under duress, right, as a minority, as a threatened group, they throw themselves behind Arab nationalism, Arab socialism. But when they're in charge, when they are a demographic majority, when they have the presidency in a situation like that, that's when they are in fact pro-American and pro-West. Those are in fact their true colors. That's their natural position. So I think taking that into its context, right? When you're a minority who's threatened, Arab socialism. When you're a majority in your small Lebanon and you have the presidency, pro-West. So that historical and demographic context does matter. And I wish Fowler had taken that into account. He also makes another argument. I mean, that first argument, the revolutionary ideologies and the pro-Arabism, I could probably talk about that one forever, and I'm sure we'll go back to it. The next argument he makes is the idea that Christians in the Middle East are not a monolith, right? So Kamal, and he certainly does, Kamal discusses Christians in the Middle East and their plight and the disappointing response, betrayal response. He speaks of them as a monolith community. Well, Fowler obviously sets that record straight by saying, no, they're actually quite diverse. You have Chaldeans, you have Copts, you have Maronites, you have everyone else, which is absolutely true. I don't know that Fowler really drove that point home as well as he could have, because while he stated the fact that, no, they're not a monolith, they're in fact a diverse community, I'm not sure how that really affects Kamal's thesis. But, I mean, I wish he just played that out a little bit more. There probably is something there. And then his invocation, the third point that he makes, is that Christians too have leveraged faith or Christianity as a political tool. And again, he cites the Camille Chamoun thing, 1958, Christian president, implores Western intervention because we are a Christian nation. Well, that's not actually how it played out. In fact, he came to the United States making an appeal to the Eisenhower Doctrine, right? Because the Nasrites coming out of Egypt were a socialist movement. They were a Russian-aligned communist franchise, you could call it, that was threatening the Middle East in the late 50s and 60s. So I don't think he came to Eisenhower and said, we're a Christian country, help your brothers. I think it was a political thing. It was a communism thing. But even if he had, I mean, I don't know. Again, I don't know what point, or I wish he had kind of closed the loop on that point a little bit more definitively, with a little bit more drive. Because one of my critiques for Christians in the Middle East, not even a critique of either of these articles, is that we don't do a good enough job of demonstrating our common cause with the West. So if anything, I really do think that Fowler's criticism, his rebuttal, is a wonderful action plan to say, how can Christians in the Middle East fix all these perceived differences or perceived insufficiencies, whatever you want to call it, historical sins, I don't know. How can we show the world that we share common cause, that we are Western-oriented? Oh, by the way, footnote, Christianity came out of the Middle East, and Christianity was the basis of Western civilization. So creating that dichotomy and saying Israel is the only Western-oriented, the only Western-oriented political entity, that's for darn sure. But Christians in the Middle East need to show themselves better for who they are. But of course, for the last 100 years, they've been under duress politically and religiously. So sometimes showing those true colors was certainly at their own peril. Let's see here. Fowler then kind of jumps into the argument that evangelical pastors, and this is an absolutely good point I agree with, have limited influence over foreign policy. Obviously, they have a platform on their pulpit, but they're not writing policy. They're not in think tanks. I mean, great point. So that's kind of an important point that it seems like Kamal was trying to make that really didn't go anywhere. And then, of course, a really good point he makes, and I think one of the most important points, apart from the rhetoric being extreme in Kamal's article, is he's not really making any proposals. He's saying, it's a policy of betrayal, and here's what hasn't been done, and here's what Israel is doing every day, and here's what U.S. policymakers are doing in response. But he doesn't say, okay, well, what does supporting Christians in the Middle East mean? What does that look like? Don't bring a policy problem unless you can offer a policy solution. And I think Fowler does a good job of pointing that out. So I think the bottom line is I agree with what you're saying. Here's not why we shouldn't be helping Christians in the Middle East, but here are some historical reasons why it hasn't happened. So it's not justifying, it's explaining. I thought they were both good in their own way, but for sure I thought it was an interesting conversation.
Well, okay, so that's great. That's a great basis on which to have this conversation. I want to bring in my colleagues here, but before I do that, I want to kind of do a devil's advocate thing here. Something make an argument I've heard several people make in kind of the foreign policy realm. Our friend Walter Russell Mead, very strong Christian, someone who cares very much personally, I know this for a fact, about Christians of the Middle East, will nevertheless make an argument that's kind of like, look, U.S. foreign policy is, for a variety of reasons, not built to, help beleaguered Christians. If you want to do that through nonprofit, non-governmental work, right, like what the United States, the American people did during the Armenian genocide, right, the first, the biggest, I'd say the most successful kind of international religious freedom effort we ever did. Huge story that no one ever talks about. Fine, that's good, but U.S. foreign policy, come on. I mean, Walter would say something like, the best thing for Christians of the Middle East is to have stability. And the best way for the Middle East to have stability is for the United States to work with the existing powers, which are not Christian, to create as much peace, if we can call it that, as possible, right? And the Christians will benefit. But to sort of do Middle East policy from the starting point of Middle East Christians, and wow, we should care about them and design policy around that problem, is to sort of let the tail wag the dog, right? I've worked so long on this issue that that argument falls hard on my ear. I find it insufficient. I do think there are things the government can do, but I don't think it's a crazy argument. I'm wondering, Mark, James, thinking about all that Rich has just said, and this kind of counter position, well, I mean, to what extent is helping Christians of the Middle East a legitimate aim of U.S. foreign policy, in your view?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Robert. And I'd want to sort of, from the hip, give sort of two cheers to Walter Mead's basic position with some preliminary questions. Going back to the language of betrayal, when I was reading it, the question that was foremost in my mind is, what does an American president owe foreign Christian communities so that by not providing that thing, the American president has now betrayed those Christians? Like, what is that thing that is owed? And then if we can identify what that thing is that's owed, where does that obligation come from? Like, what's it grounded in? And if it's grounded in something like a shared Christian identity, then what happens when the American president no longer shares that Christian identity? Does their special obligation somehow shift? And now maybe, they owe a special obligation to Muslims or to Jews or to, whatever. So that's just my initial question, is there a special obligation that's there? And then also just vis-a-vis the special obligation we know that the president has to his or her own people. How does that square with this real or imagined special obligation that they now possibly owe to foreign Christian communities? How does that work? So lots of your initial question about how all this affects American foreign policy is, for me right now, the central question, or at least the starting point.
I think it's great. If I could jump in, I thought that's a great observation, a great question to pose, Mark. I don't think there is a philosophical or legal or any sort of obligation that can be explained in any kind of in any way that could be binding or anything like that. I think Kamal's argument, and I'm not defending his extreme position or even his examples, but I think the thesis bears some kind of explanation. I think the obligation, one, is the fact of shared identity, or at least religious identity, one of decency, one of the United States being a blessed nation, the United States of having a responsibility to protect that all nations share, right, under UN R2P standard. And also the fact that, hey, we broke it, we fix it kind of thing. Now, obviously, we didn't go in there in 2003 to break anything, But I think that's his sort of argument there. Um, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I do understand it. And I think, and it's a great point you bring. Well, what if tomorrow we don't have a Christian president, or even a Christian majority, or even anything of that sort? And I think that may be a very real eventuality to be dealt with. But I think the idea is today we do, and for the last 250 years now we do. And even if not for that, I think that the appeal to decency and U.S. blessing and responsibility and mandate counts for something.
For sure. If I may just respond briefly, I agree with all those sort of preliminaries there, but I still question how those preliminaries land on an obligation to foreign Christians qua Christians, and not as a beleaguered people being unjustly persecuted, things like this, right? So, we could shift the example to a negative one in which we don't find common decency and go back to 98, 99, when the Christian Serbs were brutalizing the Kosovar Muslims. And it seems that everything you just said about American responsibility would dictate, would demand that we land on the side of the Muslims. And that caused, I was in Eastern Europe at the time, that caused all sorts of consternation because decent, I would say otherwise decent Christians were demanding that American foreign policy not fall in line behind the Muslims, but at least take, or at most take, a neutral stance and not fight against other Christians, which I find anathema to all.
No, there's another example that's even kind of more timely, and not so much in the news, but I think important, and that's India. James, you were in India, right? And we spoke about this a bit, but Christians of India these days are not in a great position. Having said that, India, kind of an important country, big, powerful country, especially if we're worried about China, worried about the Indo-Pacific. To what extent does our obligation toward these Christians, assuming that it's there, trump or kind of mitigate things that we would otherwise do with India that are arguably much more important for maybe us and the whole world? I don't know, right? That's a difficult question.
Here, can I talk about India for a second, Robert? Because to be honest, all of you have much more Middle East expertise than I. But I can talk a little bit about this one example because I had this trip to India back in November where I learned a good deal. But on the subject of what would be best for Christians all around the world is global stability, a U.S.-led world order, basically. But then we get put in this uncomfortable position of well, then how many, for that overarching theory to work, how many individual Christian communities do we have to see get swallowed up in our pursuit of this broader stability? But so with India, India is an emerging power. It's probably, to give a very truncated geopolitical analysis, it's extremely important to countering China. And there's a lot of tension between the Indians and the Chinese going back for decades and even longer than that. But basically, Narendra Modi's Hindu Nationalist Party is, pretty anti-Christian, somewhat anti-Christian. They're at least accused of, in various circumstances, being neutral about the persecution of Christians across India. And so that presents challenges for we as Christians in the United States. So we oftentimes talk about the left and the State Department as being a bunch of browbeating scolds of maybe we shouldn't be scolding whatever diplomats from African and Arab nations about their human rights. We should just work on combating Iran, whatever the real problem is. But then that kind of gets turned on its head for us as conservative Christians when in India there's this population that we're concerned about. And then we become the State Department scolds, being hey, you better respect those human rights and freedom of religion. But what I'm really trying to say here is that the argument for basically working with the BJP, working with the Modi government from in a way that will ultimately be pro-Christian is that China is the greatest threat to religious liberty and Christianity and basically everything that the United States holds dear, not just in East Asia, but around the entire world. China is trying to influence all across Africa and Latin America and Southern and Southeast Asia, trying to, if not remake the world in China's own image, make sure that the world is not made in the image of America at least. And so China, poses such an exponentially unfathomable threat to to religious liberty, whatever values you want to pick, that actually it would be best for America geostrategically and for Christianity as a whole, if you can be that abstract, for the United States to invest in partnering with India, even despite the situation with Christians there not being quite what we want it to be. But so that's like a really hard compromise. That's like a tension we have to live with. Or we've been talking about the Middle East and during the Cold War of like what was the real most important thing? Was it like making sure the Soviet Union fell apart and then that would lead to a flowering of religious liberty everywhere, even if then we have to partner with say Muslims or groups that seem hostile to Christians. So honestly, I'm still working that tension out. But I do see how the same thing in the Middle East, it shows up in various places where religion, it's mixed up in a lot of things.
Tuli, I want to ask you your views on this. I mean, I want to get to some specific questions with Rich about how to apply these thoughts in the context of Syria in particular and Syrian Christians. But I mean, this overall question of helping Christians, zoom out one frame, okay, religious liberty, protecting that, and then zoom out even further and you sort of work more on these larger questions of geopolitical stability and all of that. You've been doing this a long time. I mean, how do you balance these? What's the formula here? How do you think through that?
I was somewhat baffled by the first article in Mere Orthodoxy claiming the U.S. has not looked after the interest of Mideast Christians. The implication seems to be the U.S. should not pursue interest or support military actions in which Christians may be hurt. That seems to be what he's saying. So on that basis, I'm guessing 80 or 90% of the Germans hurt in World War II by American bombs were at least nominally Christian. Certainly there were many Christians in Nagasaki. The North Koreans like to claim there are no churches in North Korea because the American Air Force bombed them all. An implausible claim, but almost certainly some North Korean Christians were hurt by American bombs in Korea. Certainly many Vietnamese Catholics and others were hurt during the Vietnam War. And then the also issue is, are we just concerned about hurting Christians? As Christians, are we concerned about all human suffering? Do we just single out Christians as having our unique preoccupation? So it makes some very confusing points that I think whose ultimate purpose is basically to shift U.S. policy away against Israel and to use Mideast Christians for supporting Arab causes. And so that's a whole other avenue of thought. But it's a pretty common avenue of thought among a number of Christians on the left in the U.S. dating back 30 or 40 years. But I don't think it's a very honest avenue of thought.
So I think that's fantastic. And, it signals that there are apparently certain kinds of moral concerns that are prior to other kinds of moral concerns. One of those, later moral concerns being solidarity with Christians. And so, here is where we throw up our hands and we wish we had a Hebraic and classical moral tradition that would help us adjudicate, how to resolve these moral conflicts. And then happily we remember we have just war tradition, which does exactly these kinds of things, right? Helps us sort out these complications when we can't do all the morally good things we would like to do. And we have to figure out which moral obligations are prior to other moral obligations. And in the examples that Tuli has talked about, World War II, both in Europe and in the Asia Pacific. My example of Kosovo, James's example of India. Something like the just war tradition helps us to adjudicate how to navigate, these moral conflicts when we can't do all the morally important things that we would like to do.
Tuli, I want to follow up on that point you made and then bring the same question to Rich and then everybody, chime in. I want to talk about Syria in particular because Syria historically and even till today has been one of the more important bastions of Christianity. Different kinds of Christians, all kinds of Christians, in fact, spread across Syria. concentrated in the Wadi and Nasada area of the west, but all the way out to the northeast in the border with Iraq. Amazing history of Christianity in the territory we now know as the Syrian Arab Republic. I'd really encourage people to go. I'm a big fan, as Rich knows, of kind of Eastern Christian history, theology, culture, east of Byzantium. It's one of my hobby horses, and definitely would encourage readers to go out there and read. There's a lot more about the church that you don't know, and a lot of it happened in Syria. But for all of that, the Trump administration, an administration very much backed by America's evangelical community, large percentage of America's Catholic community, communities that care a lot about Christians of the Middle East, at least, formally. The Trump administration has now very publicly, I would even say enthusiastically, endorsed, at the urging of Turkish President Erdogan, the new and formerly jihadi president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara, and seems to be leaning in, right? I'm seeing delegations going there, and if you're speaking with Christians on the ground, this is, at the very least, kind of concerning. So here we're complicating what we just said a bit, because you could make the argument, right? The argument of India, the argument of Kosovo, that this is one of those situations where, notwithstanding the concerns of Christians on the ground, the greater good, right, the regional picture, demands that we lift sanctions on the new Syrian regime, do more with Turkey, not just in Syria, but around the region. It's a big, powerful country. They have leverage that we need. We need them against Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And that, look, I'm sorry, Christians, you're just going to have to trust us. This is probably going to work out into a situation that's better than what you have now. And, this is, in that hierarchy that, Levecki, you were just talking about, this supersedes your concerns, right? And we're not going to demand things from Ashara in terms of Christians before we give him these goodies out of, the American goodie bag. That, to me, this is like a real live example. Rich, this is something you're working on. Before I get to you, I want to ask Mark Tooley, okay, this is a word problem. How do we think about this? Are we worried that the Trump administration is doing this, or does this, in fact, fall within one of these, superior needs that we just have to pursue the way that we're pursuing it?
Obviously, Christians in Turkey don't have a lot of options. As you mentioned, they're less than 1%, not legally prohibited. If you want to start a new church in Turkey, or certainly if you wanted to create a radio station or a publishing ministry, it would be nearly impossible politically, if not legally. All kinds of problems with Erdogan. He is suppressing the opposition in Turkey, will not allow a strong opponent to run against him for the presidency. But as you say, he is an important player, and we need him in terms of Ukraine and Russia and in other ways. And the U.S. is a great power with many different aspects of our society, many of which should be condemning the Turkish president. And also our government needs to have a strong relationship with him at the same time. So it's not either or. And the same with Syria. What are the other options other than having a relationship with the new government in Syria, which in terms of human rights and basic stability is not as depraved as what it just replaced. So it's not illogical that the Trump administration has lifted many of the sanctions and is establishing relations with the hopes that the regime will be encouraged to move in somewhat positive directions. But our hopes should be realistic and not soaring. And I don't know if you're a Syrian Christian, are you hoping the U.S. Does not have relations with the new government? How does that help them?
Rich, I want to, you're in the weeds on this, both kind of general response to my question and then maybe leading into, how you practically as the head of IDC are dealing with this in a strategic way in terms of advocacy.
Yeah, when Assad was first overthrown in December of last year, everybody was scratching their head. First of all, nobody saw it coming. Not even Shura or HTS saw it coming. They were surprised that they were able to succeed. But certainly the Syrian people didn't know what to do themselves. It was like liberating North Korea kind of proportions. It was literally that dramatic. What followed the initial liberation was this sense of elation among Syrians of all political stripes, of all religions, of all everything. And then the dust started to settle, and a transitional government was put into place. And then among the Christians, or among Syrian society at large, you had those who continued to proceed with that feeling of elation, and so for the others that start to become very concerned of these new guys who are in power. We know who they are. I don't have to talk to you in great detail of who they are and what their past is, and even what their resumes look like. So all that to say, and all that to frame that, yes, I think these people are to be watched closely, and I think that's exactly what in part what U.S. policy opening up and the normalization of relations also seeks to do. And if whether or not that's what it seeks to do, that certainly will be one of the effects of opening the relations, lifting the sanctions, in the methodical, in the intentional kind of way, with benchmarks, with guardrails, and that sort of thing. I was in New Jersey this past weekend giving a talk on a closely related topic, and the Q&A question period came up, and one of the questions was just this. It was a gentleman, Syrian-American, Christian, who said, well, what are your thoughts on this? This is disastrous. This will lead to a genocide part 2, referring to the Ottoman genocide from 110 odd years ago. What are your thoughts on this? And I replied to him in a very sort of straightforward but simple way. It's like, look, this is not a good guy. These are not good folks. I mean, the military is composed of foreign fighters. That hasn't changed. The transitional government, the word transitional being the key here, is going to be there for 5 years. So I don't know how transitional that is. That's more than any American administration, single term. So that stuff there is concerning, obviously, but that we knew from the very start. But what can a continued isolation produce other than more radicalism and more desperation among the people as well as the government, and more opportunity for vulnerability for ISIS to make a resurgence? Because where you have poverty, where you have a strangled society, you have more radicalism or more opportunity and susceptibility for radicalism. So these are some concerns. I mean, right now, and we're seeing every day in the headlines, we're seeing attacks against Christian communities, individuals, churches. These are mostly, in fact, I would even say probably exclusively, individual acts, not necessarily launched or conducted by the government, but they all kind of get away without any kind of address. There's this culture of impunity. It's a pattern, and this is a huge concern. But again, there's no ideal way ahead on Syria right now, other than to say open up relations, give them guardrails, give them benchmarks, show them that we are watching and we are interested. We're ready to help you succeed, and that's a huge part of it, the carrot and the stick. We're ready to make you succeed, to help you succeed. But you got to act like a member of the international community.
Mark Levesque and James, in that order, curious your response to this. Not getting too much into the weeds, maybe on Syria policy. I'm not sure how much you followed that, but kind of the word problem, making, as Rich is saying and as Mark is saying, it's the lesser of two evils. It's not ideal. Maybe it's, some people, Christians on the ground, may see it as a betrayal. But what choice do we have? I mean, morally, strategically, any concerns about that?
I mean, I simply think that's what life looks like in a world that's been cursed by human fallenness, right? I mean, you say it in your film review, your excellent film review, by the way, of the last Mission Impossible, where, we exercise stewardship or dominion within the reality of fallenness. And that's what moral conflicts are. We can't do all the morally good things we ought to do. and that ought signals that those things are duties. We should absolutely help beleaguered Christians everywhere. Absolutely. We should also help beleaguered peoples everywhere. Absolutely. And we also have to keep our own country safe, which means we make politically minded decisions that are rooted in reality, which will sometimes mean certain duties come in conflict with other duties. And then we have to weigh the importance of those duties, and we do the good where we can, as little harm as possible. And then we move through this morally bruising world and do the best we can. I always pull back from the language of lesser evils. I think we're always aiming at the greatest possible good, which is a semantic difference in one sense, but I think it's a morally significant difference. We're doing the most good we can. And then as a nation, we ought to increase our capacity to do even more good. So if you want to help foreign Christians, then buy less Ben and Jerry's ice cream and pay your taxes so we can buy more bombs and then use them morally appropriately, etc.
I want to flag an article, Mark Tooley, you wrote. You'll have to remind me of the title, on U.S. aid and its role in U.S. foreign policy, and what the Trump administration's recent decisions to basically shrink or even cut off that aid completely have done, and how some of that should be thought about. Mark, what was the title of that article?
Generous America? ?
Right, Generous America ? Great article. I thought you laid that out really well, and it sort of goes to Levecki's point about helping people. Right, there are big onerous ways to help people. Right, invading countries, changing regimes, doing all kinds of huge military things, and then there are things that cost a 1% of the national GDP. And I think that some of the stuff you laid out in that article was worth reading. But James, I want to as we wind down here, I want to ask you, I guess, the same question, but also that India anecdote, and we spoke about it at length, I remember, in the office. How do you said you're processing it, and that's, I'm sure, your final answer for now, but I don't know. You left India. Obviously, you're balancing these two things in your head: the geopolitical necessity of working with India, and ideally as closely as possible, the BJP India, and yet I'm sure things you hear, like I hear from Christians on the ground, that, guys, it's really not great over here. How are you working above our heads with the guy who's basically responsible for the changing atmosphere in the country? I don't know. Let's shift from lesser of two evils to Mark's language of greatest possible good. What's your best answer at this point? How could the latter, the second element, be folded to some extent in the first?
Yeah, leaving India, I definitely remember thinking wow, now I know how Henry Kissinger must have felt, which is not good for all the compromises, if that's the right phrase, or strategies he had to pursue that many people still consider either immoral or morally ambiguous. Or of course, he also, of course, has his share of fans. I think when it comes to India and how we could tell ourselves, maybe this is just self-deception, but how I would phrase why it still is overall the right thing to work with Modi, even apart from the sort of countering China justification, would be something like, the United States, once we have a closer partnership with India, will be in a better position to effect some kind of positive change for the Christians there. Whether or not that's true, I guess I don't know. But no, I don't think I have anything to add that that Mark has not said. I think with al-Shura in Syria, whether or not there could be a better leader, there could be a better government in Syria, is a hypothetical. But I think the truth is that the American public is so tired, and the world at large is so tired of hearing about constant conflict in the Middle East. I think people in general are pretty ready to hope for the best. And if al-Shura turns out to be as bad as Assad, I suppose that's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it. But I don't, complicated questions.
Can I ask a question, Robert? Do we have time?
Sure.
Sure. The obligations to so we've got limited actions that we can do. We've accepted that as a truism. What responsibilities? So you signaled, there's government actions we can do. There are non-governmental actions that we can do. The type of work that Richard is doing, which is essential. And a part of the reason why I think the work that Richard is doing is essential is the demonstration of solidarity with beleaguered peoples, right? So sometimes this is just rhetoric because there's nothing else we can do but proclaim our recognition of their plight, signal, the grief that causes, demonstrate, a desire for a future that's more hopeful, and then work toward that. But it just, Richard, in your work, when you sometimes face intractable problems that you have little power to change, what is the value of one, just an American, so a private citizen with an organization behind him, maybe, but also of the government being able to say the kinds of things to the degree that they can say them, that signals to a place like India or to a place like Saudi Arabia or Syria that yes, we recognize the political realities and the reasons we have to have a relationship, but we lament particular kinds of behavior that your government is doing, and we stand with the people that you're harming. And maybe you can't say it quite so overtly, but what is the value of at least the proclamation of solidarity? Is that just hollow words? Does that serve a real purpose? I think of Albert Camus, as a secularist, lamenting that the Vatican didn't say more during World War II, when he felt that they were able to at least say more against Nazism, etc.
Yeah, great question. I think the show of solidarity or the expression of solidarity, it has a nice ring, but unless there's action behind it, or at least advocacy for action behind it, it almost seems to the people on the ground like, oh, geez, we've seen this before. Thanks a lot. I think our purpose, though, and that's not to devalue or discredit the importance of expressions of solidarity. They are certainly important in their own right. But I think the purpose of an organization like IDC is a couple things. One, advocacy for action that is that will preserve these threatened communities, while at the same time taking into account and integrating U.S. interests, right? So, because these are not, they cannot operate on two different planes, right? Otherwise, we just wouldn't be doing an effective job. So that's one. And the other, of course, is to educate, to express. I mean, at the beginning of this conversation, I said, if Fowler's article does anything, and I think it does a lot of good things, but if it does anything at all, it provides a really important roadmap, not just for Christians in the Middle East, but also for diaspora Christians and for their advocates and those who hope to speak on their behalf. Not that we can assume to speak on their behalf, but that's our mandate. So to educate, to say why they are worth giving your attention, if not taking action for. Again, a lot of these problems are you really can't navigate these problems. A lot of them are catch-22s and things that maybe U.S. policy won't be able to fix. But we'd be remiss and really accountable if we are derelict on that duty. Now, accountable to who? And on what basis? Based on your initial question. Well, what's our commitment? What's our duty? What's that all based in? And I would again say absolutely nothing. Nothing legally, nothing official, nothing binding, other than it's a moral duty that some may feel and others may not. And those who don't are not wrong for not feeling it, because there is nothing codified that says they must. But the individual, like myself, would feel morally derelict if we didn't do what we could to educate and advocate for action, despite the intractability of these problems.
I want to flag a book I found so interesting when I read it the first time. It's called The Burning Tigris: The Armenian Genocide and America's Response. And it is a real-life historical story about what the American people, and it did start largely among the people, right? Churches, kids saving their lunch money, all determined to help the poor Armenians, right? There were people from the highest, part of society, including presidents and major political and cultural leaders down to average people in the pews, and kind of what that movement was able to achieve in a relatively short amount of time, that eventually manifested in policy, right? Because politically it mattered to the country. And that's, I think, really where a lot of this ends up going, is that, okay, maybe on its face, on the merits, helping Christians of the Middle East doesn't make sense geopolitically in a vacuum. But when the American people, right, feel that it does, and they are speaking out and doing things, obviously in a democracy, that makes it important, right? And so there's a kind of upside down way to approach the question. And I think, Rich, what you're doing and how you're explaining what you're doing really is the embodiment of that, right? It's a different way of talking about these issues. It's a different way of speaking, believing that, if the American people could understand who these people are and why they matter, there are ways in which the American people, speaking collectively, can influence policy, right? It may not lead to exactly the result that maybe people on the ground would like, but it will make it better, and it will at least give them the proverbial seat at the table. I want to ask you one last question, actually two, and then ask that second question to my colleagues. First question, IDC, what do you guys got right now that's really important that you're working on that you want to mention, and how do people follow you? And then second question, this is sort of a popcorn question, is this week I'm asking who's your favorite Bible character and why, briefly?
Can I say Jesus, or is that?
Oh, yeah. No. You cannot. I forgot to add that. Jesus,
That was
excluding
mine.
Jesus, because that's too easy.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, as far as IDC, so last year we actually witnessed some really great success with regard to Iran. Two of our biggest pieces of legislation last year, and I'm starting there because it flows into this year, two of our biggest pieces of legislation that passed and were signed by the president were to hold Iran accountable, to paralyze their ability to finance and train and equip their proxy organizations throughout the Middle East, as well as the Quds Force centrally. That was by getting a hold of their petroleum and industry, as well as exports of missiles and weapons technology. This year, that's actually transitioning to legislation doubling down, actually codifying the maximum pressure approach to Iran. So that's our biggest piece of legislation. We have a number of other pieces of legislation holding Azerbaijan accountable, as well as another bill that will make official curriculum through the U.S. Library of Congress on the bill that was passed recognizing the Armenian genocide of 1915. So if that passes, that'll get the ball rolling on creating a curriculum at the Library of Congress, and then that would be integrated, hopefully, eventually, throughout the country in school curricula. So that's really what we're focusing big on this year. We have our annual Capitol Hill Advocacy Day, September the 17th. We urge everybody to register, because spots will fill up, as they always have. They usually fill up late, so I'm not saying you're going to miss the boat. People usually register last minute, but you don't want to wait last minute in any case.
Where do people go? I know indefenseofchristians.org. If people wanted to sign up, for example, for that,
Yeah.
or newsletter, where would they go?
Yeah, so you can go to indefenseofchristians.org. You can sign up for our newsletter, our mailing list in general, get on there. And you can find updates, you can find articles published, you can find podcast episodes, events, videos, and so forth. That'll bring you to our YouTube channel, which has all that stuff. Really, most of our content is on YouTube. Articles, of course, are on the website. So yeah, indefenseofchristians.org. We're on social media, on Facebook as well. So you can find us there.
And you have a podcast also, right?
Yeah, it's called In the Middle. The name In the Middle, people usually scratch their head. It's because, well, historically Christians have always been in the middle, and that is kind of the reason for political and humanitarian emergencies happening all the time, is because we're a minority. We find ourselves between Rome and Byzantium. Rome and Persia, I should say. We find ourselves between the Turks and Kurds, Sunni, Shia, and that's always been the unfortunate situation we find ourselves in. And as a stylistic point, whenever I have two guests, I always sit in the middle. So
Very good.
so yeah, check us out. Our episodes are on every podcast platform you find, YouTube and all the others, the audio ones. My favorite Bible character. Gosh, you took Jesus
Stumped
away.
it, didn't
Yeah.
There are more characters in the Bible than Jesus.
There are
Rich
many. There are
Ghazal.
many, but I always focus on. I would have to say Peter, because
Okay.
one, he's. I know that's a cop out too, maybe, but I think I would
No.
have to say Peter, or possibly Job. I'll say Peter because he. Obviously, he was the rock upon which the church was built. He felt the pressures that we all feel for our faith every day, denying Christ. We may not deny Christ in word, but we sometimes do it in deed, in thought, and in action. But he knew his duty. He was given a mandate by Christ, and he served that well. And the church that we see today comes as a result of his leadership. Job, because he went through hell and he didn't lose his faith.
Very good. Okay, I'm going youngest to oldest. James, favorite Bible character?
Of course, maybe changes by the day, but I'll just one off my mind right now is Esther, for the way that she shows us, for the way her story shows us that the most unexpected of people in the worst of times can do the most amazing things through God, and it's something to always remind ourselves of, for times such as these, all that. So always good to reread Esther.
Love it. Mr. Levesque.
It's got to be Balaam's donkey, because if God can speak through an ass, there's hope for me.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
And probably my wife's. So
Balaam's donkey. I love it. Okay, Mr. Tooley, patriarch.
Who's my favorite patriarch? Or
No, who's your favorite Bible character? Old, New Testament, whatever you like. No Jesus, though. We love him, but not for this conversation.
The New Testament, I'll go with the Apostle John, since he's the only one who was not martyred. He was a survivor and apparently died naturally, so good for him. In the Old Testament, as a Methodist, maybe I'll go with Elijah or Enoch, in that they were bodily assumed into heaven. They were perfected on earth, achieved the stage of Wesleyan perfection and holiness. So they should be models for us all.
there's an anti-death trend there, Thule.
That's right.
Wow. Well, mine's King David. I don't know how anyone picks anyone but him. I think if only for the fact that his life is recorded in so much minute detail. We basically have his diary in the Psalms, so you get like the full human experience with David. Those are all good answers. I forgot about that Wesleyan perfection thing. That we got to do an episode on just that. That's interesting. I don't know how it figures into U.S. foreign policy, but I'm sure we can find a hook.
Absolutely.
Well, Rich, I want to thank you for really excellent conversation, very insightful, and encourage everyone to go to indefenseofchristians.org. They do amazing work, and really want to thank you personally, Rich. I know you spent a lot of time on this, and it's very important work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone else. It was a pleasure. Thanks.